Hey everyone, Muneeb here, co-founder of Blockstack. Really excited to have Sergey here from Chainlink. Welcome, Sergey.
Great, good to see you again. Thank you for having me.
So I'm gonna start this fireside chat with a little story that not a lot of people know about. Sergey and I actually shared an office space way back in 2013 and early parts of 2014. So imagine like how small the crypto industry was then. This is East Village, New York. And I think that office building, just for people who are familiar with the New York tech scene, it was the old Foursquare office. And Foursquare was like this big, kind of like interesting startup from New York. And both of us used to work in the old Foursquare building.
Yeah, it was great. It was very, very early, and there was a ping pong table and all this stuff, and we like had different desks in different places, and we chatted about stuff. Yeah, it was great. A while ago. It's amazing how fast time flies in the crypto Wild West. But yeah, it was great.
I think if you describe this in Bitcoin years, so Bitcoin was trading at like $80 or $90 back then.
Something like that. Yeah, I don't exactly remember, but yeah, it was pretty. It was pretty niche. It was pretty niche. When you would go and talk to people about blockchains back then, I remember they would be like, "What is that?" And I'm like, "Bitcoin. You know what Bitcoin is? That's a blockchain. That's the technology behind Bitcoin." They're like, "Oh, the thing for drugs." Oh no, I don't need any drugs, thanks. And like all of the conversations with even pretty technically kind of informed startup people would be around that, because everything in the news was about that. And so that's like how it all started out. And it's actually good, because I think it filtered a lot of people that had to look deeper into it, and they had to like understand. And so it's a non-obvious problem. But I remember that's what I would come back to that office after having a bunch of meetings talking about blockchains, and there would just be the extent of misunderstanding at the time was just at an all-time, high.
Yeah, and it would feel like a rabbit hole, right? If you're like, when I started kind of like discovering this, it's like you're reading new things and it's fascinating, and you're going deeper and deeper and deeper, and the rabbit hole is just never ending, right? Like you're fascinated by it, and people outside, they don't see it. It felt like a weird disconnect. So that's where, if you would find other people who are experiencing the same thing as you do, like Sergey and other people who are around in New York, like you would connect with them. You'll be like, oh, I can actually have a conversation with you at a much deeper level, instead of like just defending that, hey, Bitcoin is not for drugs.
Yeah, I mean, this is one of the reasons that I actually got so involved in building things in the industry. Is I would find people like this, like you, Muneeb, and like others that would see the value in all this, and the value. So it was actually really interesting, because the value seemed immense, but somehow only a few people could really understand why that value existed, or why that value was a thing, and that, to me, seemed like a really kind of a huge, worthwhile thing to work on, because it wasn't one of these places where there were like 50,000 people trying to do something, like turn nothing into something, right? It was a place where there was so much usefulness, but somehow all of whatever bad press or whatever somehow insulated that world from attention and building and stuff. And so it was actually a really cool place to be. It still is.
I think we can maybe dig a little bit deeper into, how did you get into this space, right? Like, what were you doing right before it? How did you get interested? Why did you start working on smart contracts?
Yeah, so initially I was mining, like as far back as 2011. And so that was just out of curiosity and trying to understand what this was. And that's really all that you could do, right? Is you could mine some Bitcoin and maybe some other tokens here and there, but you would use a GPU you have. And I actually heard a lot about that from the gaming community, because I thought that Bitcoin was some kind of gaming digital currency or something. And I realized eventually that it wasn't attached to any game, and it had all these unique properties where it would just continue to live regardless of even any entity existing. And so that's the first thing that hooked me, that I knew the history of digital currencies, and I didn't know how to point to any example that had that, kind of longevity. And then from there, I mean, it was all kind of stagnant for a few years, from like 2011 to about 2013, 14. And then in 2013, 14, you had some of the first smart contract platforms appear. And they started making a lot of grand promises, and the technology was super early and super limited. But if you looked into it and you thought, okay, well, yeah, I can do something, I can create some kind of tamper-proofness and reliability for this transaction about this category of economic activity. Well, like, how far can we take that? And even though the technology was very early, after like a few experiments and building a few things, it became clear that as the technology developed, you would have all these other transactions and all these other contract types that would make their way into this format. And I think the thing that always got me hooked on all this stuff was, if you actually understand the difference between smart contracts as a method of agreement that you could engage in versus traditional centrally run unreliable contracts, no rational actor would ever choose unreliable contracts, right? Like if you have a guarantee for an outcome versus no guarantee, no rational actor is going to choose something that's more risky, less reliable, and less likely to give them what they deserve. And so that really drove me forward into that smart contract direction very, very heavily. Yeah. So how about you, Muneeb? How did you decide to get into the crypto industry?
Yeah, I think my journey was a bit different. I was more doing R&D work. I was finishing my PhD at Princeton, living in New York, so I used to commute. So I was living in East Village, commuting to Princeton and back. And I think for me, it was a little bit like the decision was that I was always fascinated by commercializing cutting edge research, but instead of doing it from a university, I decided that let's go out into the startup sector, and maybe there's a way to even do like cutting edge R&D work and try to commercialize it. More specifically, the kind of problems I was looking at were more about secure internet infrastructure. That how can you build like a more secure foundations for an internet where, all these problems that are, if anything, more pronounced today than they were back then, where, Google or Facebook, they own all of your data, they're tracking you everywhere. Can you have a more private foundation for some of these applications? And obviously, Bitcoin for me, like, I think the first time I heard about it was 2011. And it was Arvind. I don't know if people know him. He's a professor at Princeton who wrote a book on Bitcoin. And I think he's known in Bitcoin circles because of it. He joined and he was starting reading groups on Bitcoin. And that was, I think, the first time I heard about it. But for me, I got really interested when I started looking at the Bitcoin blockchain or blockchain in general as a potential solution to a more secure internet, right? Like if you could start anchoring some of the critical infrastructure, like domain names or public key infrastructure, even how you discover applications and storage, those kind of things on the blockchain. And this is, you mentioned that you were mining some other coins as well. Maybe Namecoin was one of them. So this is 2013, I think, when Namecoin was going through some transitions, and people discovered like some bugs in it, and we started working on the project just to see like, hey, should this be the way that these new types of assets should be implemented, or should they be done directly on top of Bitcoin or some other way? And in some ways, like, we're still working on the same thing, right? Like we are now, there are many projects now who build these smart contracts or applications in different designs. And what Blockstack does is really brings apps and smart contracts to Bitcoin. So our blockchain connects to Bitcoin and kind of like benefits from the security of Bitcoin. So it's amazing, like how long the journey is, and it still feels like this is the early innings, right? Like we're nowhere close to, so it's just like less than 0.5% of the internet population currently is on these crypto networks. So I think it's definitely super early, even right now. So speaking of that, like how would you compare, like let's call it 2014 to then 2017, when there was this bull run, a lot more people got introduced to crypto, and then to today, like what has changed? What are the kind of like the major fundamental things that have changed in these periods?
Yeah, in 2014, I think you had an environment where you had the very first smart contract platforms out there. And what they would do is they would either try to stick smart contract functionality into Bitcoin through op-return, which, the Bitcoin direction didn't work out because op-return got caught from 80 bytes to 40 bytes. And a lot of interesting things like Counterparty and Mastercoin and a number of things suffered from that. And so they didn't build that functionality around Bitcoin. And as that was happening, as people were trying to reason through how do I build smart contract functionality into and around Bitcoin, you had a parallel world of these really, really early platforms that were delivering really interesting new functionality, right? Like for their time, they delivered innovative, new, amazing things. And so what I saw was a few small groups of people that had the capacity to do software development in addition to mining, starting to build either applications or deciding to build these kind of smart contract platforms, right? And so in 2014, you had this kind of period where there was a shakeup between what is the smart contract platform that's going to go somewhere. And then what you basically saw is you saw some competition around that, and nobody could understand what the use case was, right? Like nobody could get their mind around exactly what is the winning killer app of smart contracts. What is it going to be? Is it going to be IoT? Heard a lot about that. Is it going to be tokens? Heard a lot about that. Is it going to be, global shipping, something there? And eventually in the transition to 2017, tokenization basically won out, right? So tokenization got packaged as a usable tool within a system like Ethereum, right? And people ended up generating a bunch of tokens, and that generated a bunch of value. And so you had a bunch of tokens, and then an ecosystem around those tokens developed for trading, and there's just so that was the nature of it, right? The nature of it was let's generate a bunch of tokens, because that's the functionality that seems to have won as the killer app, at least in that time, in that space of time. And it also has very strong economic dynamics for people that make the tokens and people that buy the tokens and people that do something else with the tokens, right? And so it kind of took on a life of its own. What it also did is it gave the space a certain kind of hue around that is what blockchains are about and for, right? And so like how when we started, we would have to talk about like blockchains and Bitcoins as related to some weird dark market, some dynamic because something happened there. In the 2017 period, everything became about tokens, right? And now what I think we're finally seeing is the thing that you and me kind of got into this industry for, right? Is we're finally starting to see smart contracts that they can use tokens as collateral. And that's great, right? Like, sure, you can absolutely use all these highly reliable tokenized assets within these smart contracts. But I think we're finally seeing smart contracts as their own contracts, as their own kind of encapsulated pieces of value that aren't related to the generation of a token, right? They can use the tokens within the contract, but you finally have financial products. We have live right now crop insurance for all different parts of the world using oracles, using smart contracts. And that doesn't have anything to do with anybody generating a token about that, right? It just has to do with the ability to write a smart contract, provide weather data to it, and kind of prove that something happened and is tamper-proof.
Yep.
How have you seen it evolve from your point of view?
No, I think that kind of makes sense. In my mind, it was a little bit like the early 2014 days, and I think that's where the term even altcoins comes from. So there's basically Bitcoin, and then everything else is categorized as an altcoin because if you're not Bitcoin, and those were experiments, right? People are trying to run experiments. They're trying to see what other use cases of blockchains are there, and the killer app, at least for 2017, I completely agree. It was in some ways like it was a more disruptive model for Silicon Valley. That people who traditionally don't have access to angel investment, VC funds, and that's why we saw it was a little bit like Wild West. So with any Wild West rush, you see people who are opportunistic or even malicious actors. They come in and they try to kind of like utilize the opportunity. But there was something fundamentally new there, right? And I think it's here to stay. Like it's not going anywhere. People, same with yes, there might have been some things that were not completely in the clear from a regulations perspective, but people would figure these things out, right? Like over time, this model is here to stay, where access to capital just became cheaper, and there's a new way to start a company and even to take it public in a way, quote unquote public, right? Like because these are the trading markets, and so it has completely changed, how people think about startups, or even how people think about open source. Like open source projects were so hard to kind of like raise funding for. Like you have like these handful of developers who are just maintaining these projects just because they're passionate about it. And now these open source protocols are commanding like billions of dollars of value on the open markets. So I think it has just changed the game forever. So there are benefits to it as well. One is the craze that happened. And I agree. I think 2020 feels a lot more real. Like 2020 feels like it's not a house of cards that something has value because everybody thinks it has value, and it depends on something that can also break down. But the example that you mentioned, that if someone is trying to get insurance on crops, it's a real world business use case, right? Or one example I think about is Bitcoiners. They don't want to sell their Bitcoin. They want to hold their Bitcoin, but they might want to take a USD loan out. They don't care about if this is happening on Ethereum or some other blockchain, or they just want to not sell Bitcoin, not get a tax hit, and get some liquidity in USD, right? So that's a real business use case. And if you're doing it on smart contracts, you're doing it in a way that is fully decentralized. I think that's real. And what we're seeing is we looked at the market. I think we've traditionally been more in the Bitcoin camp, mostly because of security. It's a blockchain where people are generally very thoughtful about the design of the system. It doesn't change. It's not that experimental. It has a lot of hash power. But then we wanted to introduce smart contracts, but do it in a way that the contracts themselves are more precise, so that it's like trying to save the developers from hurting themselves, right? So if the language makes it hard for developers to kind of like write buggy code, or makes it easy to do automated audits. I think right now in the industry, the standard is kind of like, okay, you've written your code in JavaScript, but like Solidity, which is basically JavaScript, but you should try and get manual audits on it, right? With our work with Clarity and Stacks 2.0, you can automate like formal proofs of correctness. And in general, it's not Turing complete. It is more limited on purpose, so that it's a more precise tool for writing these very kind of like critical smart contracts. If people are keeping like hundreds of millions of dollars of worth of assets, or if they're insuring like hundreds of millions of dollars of worth of assets, you can't have bugs in the code, and you need to like secure it with the most secure system available, Bitcoin. Like that's kind of like our thinking. And I think where our recent partnership kind of like led to, which I'm pretty excited about, is that as soon as you start feeling better or about the architecture of the smart contracts themselves, that okay, this language can give you mathematical proofs, the assets are actually secured by Bitcoin, so it's not like some weird fork would happen on the blockchain and you might have some complications there. The next biggest attack vector, in my view, is oracles, right? Where because your smart contract is as secure as the data feed, right? If someone can control the oracle, they can actually like change the outcome. And I think that's where we start looking at the work that you're doing, and I'm super excited about basically getting Chainlink on the Stacks 2.0 platform.
Yeah, I'm very excited as well, and I definitely see that there's a lot of things that can be improved and built on in terms of how languages work and how smart contracts get built, and a lot of these other dynamics. But from your point of view, what is the significance of having a well-made oracle on Stacks 2.0 and that being able to work well with Clarity? How do you view that?
Yeah, so I think it's, as I said, it's mostly about data feeds. That imagine that your confidence level that the feed is actually decentralized and is verified by multiple parties, and you can actually trust even the authenticity of the parties. And it's like, I think it makes a huge difference. One way to look at this is if you do like a security audit, like a full security audit of the system, you're only as secure as the weakest link, right?
Exactly.
So I think what happens with oracles is that people don't realize that might be the weakest link in your entire security architecture. And I think the way that you, I've seen kind of like you work and evolve your architecture and being very thoughtful about, here are the different, like physically different networks or entities that are actually running them. Here's how you collect those feeds. Here's how you get the verifications on them. And here's your confidence level. You're also giving people a little bit of a spectrum that you pick the level of confidence that you want to have, and that's actually decentralization. I think sometimes people often confuse decentralization with you need to be on one end of a spectrum or be extreme
Right.
about it.
Exactly.
Like decentralization is about freedom of choice. Like I need to have the freedom of keeping my Bitcoin on my hardware wallet or using Coinbase. Like it is about, I have all the options available, and I think you take that approach of like here's a menu of options for you, and you guys pick depending on how critical that smart contract is for you.
Yeah, I think that's exactly right. I think people really need to view these more advanced smart contracts that we're so excited about and are now coming to life here in 2020. It's like probably one of the few good things happening in this year, right? Is that you need to view them end to end, right? So you before you had a contract and a piece of code working in a singular system, and that worked for tokens because the contract generated all the data it would ever need to have access to and work with. And so it securely worked in that kind of walled garden of a blockchain. But a blockchain only knows about what's in a blockchain, right? And so once you arrive at a place where you want to connect with the external world, you now need to extend this security model and all this decentralization and all these guarantees to meet the security audit requirements over into interacting with the real world. And I think that you're right, that's how people should view it, is they should just view these more advanced contracts that connect with real world events in this end-to-end manner. And they should evaluate the full architecture of the contract. And that's how they should evaluate their security, in my opinion.
Yep, that makes sense. So I feel like I should ask you about the recent DeFi craze, right? Like in some ways you're sitting at the heart of it because most of these contracts are getting feeds from your oracles. Like, what do you think is going on right now? But more importantly, what's the next step? How do you think that some of these things would mature over time?
Yeah, I think there's kind of three interesting dynamics. So there's a slow case for adoption, there's a fast case for adoption, and there's what drives more collateral into DeFi separately, right? So the slow case for adoption is what we're seeing now. You have anywhere from 10 to 15 million in DeFi, depending on the day. It's basically based on people using derivatives or lending or a few other kind of optimized financial products. And it makes a lot of logical sense. And if you have 350 billion in the crypto format that can make its way into DeFi, and you only have 10 or 15 billion in DeFi, you have anywhere from 2.5% to 3% of the value that could be in DeFi within DeFi, right? So there's really a huge amount of more value that can get pumped into that format. And that's I think the slow case, right? Is we now have reached a size of a community and a large enough amount of value in this crypto format that if you launch a DeFi product, you could have hundreds of millions of dollars secured in your protocol. You can go raise a VC round, and you could kind of build a quote unquote successful startup around being a DeFi company. And that wasn't the case a few years ago, right? Because there wasn't enough value to migrate in. There wasn't even 350 billion in here, and it wasn't going to get migrated into DeFi. So that's the slow case, is that our community grows on its own under its own kind of power. The fast case, I think, is if the global financial system kind of has a serious restructuring, and that restructuring leads people to want the transparency and counterparty risk assessment and actually the interest yield that blockchains and DeFi can generate. And if that restructuring of the global economy from a failure happens, then you have a really fast case for adoption, because people say, I'm getting zero yield. I have no information about counterparty risk. What am I going to do? Guess what you're going to do? You're going to go to blockchains that have yield from DeFi and where you know all of your counterparty risk, right? The third case that I think is really interesting is what happens with collateral and all the new forms of collateral that can get pumped into DeFi. Even that insurance example and other examples like that, you can even make the cash flows from those smart contracts or the smart contracts that generate that value for the real world into their own tradable units. And you're seeing this now with NFTs, you're seeing this with insurance, you're seeing this with the ability to not just generate a token and sell it on the market and that be the collateral within these DeFi protocols, but even the ability for insurance policies that are in a form of a smart contract to use their revenue as a form of collateral within DeFi. So I think you're also going to see a migration of various forms of collateral into the DeFi landscape and that's going to both diversify its risk in a way that makes it attractive to the standard consumer and the crypto landscape. And in fact, it's a great thing for the crypto landscape, because imagine if all that you had to do to earn 2 or 3% interest was take your money and turn it into some kind of token, crypto token, and then you would get 2% interest instead of 0.01% interest at a bank account. That's very possibly the path to mainstream adoption, especially in a low interest, high inflation world, which seems to be the world we might be going towards.
Yeah, so I completely agree with that. So with that in mind, like what's some kind of like ongoing work that you're more excited about from Chainlink? I know you guys are doing a bunch of things, but what's the thing that comes to mind?
In addition to the price feeds we provide, we're starting to enable a good amount of gaming through randomness, and gaming depends on randomness. Some stuff in NFTs, where NFTs get generated and turned into a form of collateral. Another thing that we're doing is in insurance, and generating a lot of new insurance products based on weather data and all kinds of other data that can be used to make insurance products that suddenly get offered to all over the world, regardless of a local legal system. And then one of the most recent things we released is this thing called proof of reserve, where we can actually prove the underlying solvency of an asset. And we've initially deployed it for something like WBTC, where we can prove that WBTC, in fact, is securing a certain amount of Bitcoin. And what that does is once you can prove that an underlying asset is sufficiently solvent, you increase the attractiveness of that collateral. And you actually increase the overall reliability and usefulness of DeFi, because it becomes not just like an idea, but it becomes a transparent, highly reliable financial product that's reliable all the way down to the underlying assets. Right? Yeah,
your risk effectively goes down, right? Because you can now prove that reserve actually exists.
Exactly. And that makes the collateral more attractive for DeFi. It makes the whole DeFi ecosystem work better, and it creates a very clear path for people to understand their counterparty risk, which is, I think, something that's going to become important. So those are the things that we're excited about and excited to provide to like the larger blockchain community and help build these next generation of smart contracts, right? I guess I would have the same question for you. What are some of the more exciting things that you're working on? How are those evolving, and where can people learn about those?
And you have 3 minutes left.
Yeah, I think it's for us, it's mostly about the Stacks 2.0 mainnet launch. So this is kind of like our master design, the blockchain that we wished existed when we were starting off. And one really interesting thing about it, and we released the economic model about this last week or so. Basically, I think a lot of people understand proof of stake, where you can stake your tokens and you're earning more of the same asset. Whereas the way our blockchain is designed, Stacks 2.0, if you're a STX holder and you are participating in consensus, you're earning Bitcoin, right? And we released out last week this calculator where people can play with different scenarios. They can see what that earning might look like for them. But I feel like earning Bitcoin, to me, just sounds like a lot more exciting, because people value Bitcoin more. And it's a unique type of a asset, because now there's a correlation between two different assets. Like you're holding one asset, you're earning the other, but at the consensus protocol there. And another effect of basically connecting to Bitcoin that way is that our smart contracts have a more native Bitcoin support. So if people want to move Bitcoin into the Stacks chain, or you even want to take certain actions based on some transaction that happened in Bitcoin, these contracts have visibility into the state of Bitcoin, which I think is a very big untapped potential. Because Bitcoin is, out of the 350 billion in crypto capital you mentioned, 200 billion is still sitting on Bitcoin, right? So how do you turn that from a passive capital to a more active capital that people can get yields on? I feel like, Sergey, we can talk for a very long time, and part of me feels that at some day we'll have to sit back and see that those early 2013, 2014 days, were they late 80s or early 90s?
Yeah, something like that. Yeah.
In terms of the internet age. But where can people find you, like on Twitter or some website where they can learn more about
Yeah, I mean, chain.link is our site. It's at Twitter. It's Twitter/Chainlink. We actually post a lot of updates there about new things we're doing, new releases, new usage, all kinds of new things. So Twitter seems to be the place that's getting output. I'm at Sergey Nazarov on Twitter. I don't use it too much, but I'm starting to do slightly more tweets about some interesting ideas. That's the place where people can find out about what we're doing. How about you? Where can they find out more about Stacks 2.0 and Blockstack?
Yeah, so I'm at Muneeb, MUNEEB on Twitter. Blockstack is at Blockstack. And I think those are some good places where we post updates on our Stacks 2.0 mainnet. Great.
Congratulations on moving that forward. I think it's exciting, and looking forward on working together on a lot of cool smart contracts. Thank you. Thank you for working with us.
Great having you.
Great to chat with you again. Thank you.